Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game. And believe it or not, there are new nerfs to Hearthstone on the way. Blizzard just announced that 7 cards are going to be receiving nerfs. And I wanted to take a closer look at those cards, the nerfs, how those cards and their changes will impact the meta and frankly change Hearthstone pretty significantly, I think. So let's go ahead and jump right into the nerfs, starting off with the first one that Blizzard announced, which might surprise you and certainly surprised me. It is the Rockbiter weapon. This is not a card that's typically considered oppressive. I don't think a lot of people were calling for nerfs with this card, but it's pretty clear that Blizzard does not like a ton of burst damage from hand that surprises you. They've historically nerfed a lot to deal with charge cards because those typically present problems where they can just kill an opponent really quickly, and Blizzard really wants to reinforce minion combat on the field. So any sort of charge effect or really strong burst damage effect is eventually going to get nerfed, and that's the case with the Rockbiter weapon. Of course, in and of itself, +3 attack is not a big deal. That's not the problem. It's when you combo this card with the weapon Doomhammer, and you can suddenly do really crazy burst damage from hand, that it becomes an issue. So Blizzard, I guess, wanted to cut back on that. It's still possible to pull off a Doomhammer double Rockbiter turn. Since it's only going to be 2 mana, you can Doomhammer for 5, double Rockbiter for another 4. So you can do that on turn 9 for a lot of bursts. So it's not like they removed it from the game, but they certainly made it a lot more challenging to pull that off. All that said, I don't actually think that's the biggest implication of this change. I think the real implication of this change is limiting Rockbiter's ability to control the board in the early game. Because that's really how that card is typically used in Shaman today, not with Doomhammers necessarily all the time. And being able to kill a 3 health minion for 1 mana early in the game in the first few turns is really powerful for Shaman. Since it's so flexible as far as mana is concerned, they can play a 2 or 3 drop coin Rockbiter and have a monster board in an empty opponent's board. And that's very scary and problematic. It also allows minions to trade up very efficiently if they want to put it on a really weak totem and trade into something strong. They can also do that. So there's a lot of flexibility and power in this card. And making it 2 mana just makes those turns a little bit harder to pull off in the early game. So it's much more committal. And it doesn't feel quite as good or quite as flexible. And I think that'll have a surprisingly powerful impact on what Shaman does in the early game. Unfortunately, I think Shaman has shifted a little bit towards spells, so Lightning Bolt instead of Rockbiter, but Lightning Bolt already has some punishing aspects thanks to the overload, so this brings Rockbiter more in line with Lightning Bolt. Maybe not necessarily for today's meta, but this is a basic card that's always going to be in standard format, so Blizzard clearly has some foresight into what's coming next and perhaps how Shaman is going to evolve, and thinks that this is an important change. So it's not something I called for necessarily, but I think it's a fine change and it makes some sense to me, and it could help reduce Shaman's current power level, which is really quite ridiculous. So let's move on to the next card being nerfed. It's another Shaman card, and this is not a surprise. This is one that everybody has called for. This has been a really destructive card in the meta. I called it, I think, my second worst RNG card in the game as far as design is concerned, because it's just so ridiculously overpowered and didn't really do anything all that cool. Of course, it's Tuskarr Totemic, and before it summoned any random totem, which means you could have got things like Totem Golem, Flametongue Totem, Mana-Tide Totem, all of which are really basically 3 mana value cards on their own. Each of those would cost, well, I guess Flametongue Totem's a 2 mana card, but they're still very valuable cards on their own. And you got them for free out of Tuskarr Totemic, which also has a good body. So often you'd get something like 5 or 6 mana worth of value out of a 3-drop, and it would just always happen, and it was so powerful. And it would swing games so consistently and so decisively in the early game that it's what's made Shaman so strong in the meta. And you see Tuskarr Totemic, and they always summon Totem Golems, and it's a terribly frustrating experience. And it's not especially fun or cool either. So this is a very healthy change. Tuskarr Totemic in the future will only summon random basic totems. That means the 4 totems from your hero power. And ultimately, he's still going to be a playable card. Now, in a vacuum, it's probably not that exciting to get a total of average of, 3, 4 in stats for 3. That's sort of standard. But summoning totems in Shaman has a lot of advantages beyond just the totem itself. For instance, there's the card Thing from Below. And Tuskarr Totemic still allows you to develop your board and cheapen that eventual Thing from Below play. So also just having multiple bodies in Shaman is typically a good thing for cards like Flametongue Totem, or even Bloodlust, and there's a lot of other examples of why totems are strong. So there's still the benefit of totem synergy. You still get the reasonable stats for the cost. You still load up the board. You enable other cards. I don't think this kills Tuskarr Totemic. I think it's still a good card that you still play. It just limits the crazy swing potential. And ultimately, I think this is how this card should have been designed. Plus, even though this card's going away pretty soon as far as standard format's concerned, because it's from the Grand Tournament, and it's going to rotate out at the end of the year, or at least when the new expansion hits in 2017. That said, there's still probably 6 months where this card could be oppressive, and it does limit design space a little bit in that you can't make really crazy powerful totems with a card like Tuskarr Totemic. So putting this limitation means that Blizzard could release a really cool totem monster or something in the next expansion that's an 8/8 totem. Whereas if you had Tuskarr Totemic in its original form, that wouldn't be possible. So it opens up some options as well as far as design is concerned, which is cool. So really positive change. This is one the community and myself have called for, and I'm glad Blizzard was listening. Let's move on to the next card. This is another one that's not particularly surprising to see on this list. It's the Hunter card, Call of the Wild. Previously, it was an 8-mana spell that summoned all 3 animal companions. Arguably, I think one of the best cards in Hearthstone. Just so much raw power packed into it. It instantly refills your board. It has an instant effect thanks to charge. All 3 minions are high quality. Really, really, really powerful card. Worth arguably 10 mana plus. And it was an 8-mana card. So just a really subtle change here, which is nice. It's the same card as far as the effect is concerned, but the cost goes up by 1. And that's a good change. That's enough to slow down the card by a turn. So instead of the crazy turn 7 coin Call of the Wild, turn 8 Call of the Wild turns that were possible in the past, that just pushes that back by a turn, which is a nice impact in and of itself, because that means it takes longer to get to this big power turn. It gives your opponent more time, and it makes Hunter have to fill in those gaps a little bit because they don't have that many strong 7-8 mana cards. So deck lists are going to have to shift a little bit, which kind of steals Hunter's early game, because you're going to have to slot in more cards in the late game to get to Call the Wild. So it throws off deck building just a little, makes the decks a little less consistent, and Hunter's really good right now, so that's going to help limit the quality of Hunter and the style of decks that they're able to play just a tad, which is nice. It doesn't break anything, but it does require some tinkering and some adjustments, which means the decks will tend to get a little weaker. The other benefit of this change is that when you have an 8-mana card like Call of the Wild, it's really easy to slot in a 2-mana card on top of it once you get to turn 10. So you can Call the Wild Quick Shot, for instance, and have 8 instant damage in a huge board, which was really scary. You could Call the Wild Hero Power as well, right, for 7 damage to the face. So moving it to 9 mana means you basically can't do anything else with your turn ever. There's some 1-mana cards, obviously, you could play here and there, but they're not instant impact and they're not that strong. So really limits what you can do alongside Call of the Wild, which is a good change, because frankly Call of the Wild is enough on its own. The fact that you could do other stuff with it is oppressive. It's too much. So I really like this change. It doesn't break the card. It's still one of the best cards in the game. It's still playable. It's still going to be run. Mid-range Hunter is still going to be a deck, but it just tones it back a little bit, which is a nice healthy change. So let's move on to another card that I'm actually a little surprised to see, and I don't know that I absolutely love this change. It is Execute. The Warrior's spell allows you to destroy a damaged enemy minion. It used to cost 1 mana. Going forward, it's going to cost 2 mana. So similar, I guess, to Rockbiter weapon in many ways, but obviously Execute can be a much stronger card than Rockbiter weapon. The problem I have with this change, I guess, is that it didn't feel all that necessary. I'm not sure Execute felt problematic to me in the past. Clearly, it's super efficient removal, and Warrior has 2 super efficient removal options with Execute and Shield Slam, but it is conditional. It requires a condition. It requires an activator, which was usually punishing in some way. For instance, you might have to hit a minion with your face with a weapon to damage it and then use Execute. Clearly, Warrior has gotten more and more tools to more easily execute with cards like Ravaging Ghoul. Doesn't feel like a downside to activate and execute. So maybe that's Blizzard's thinking. Maybe they have more cards coming out into the future that are going to easily damage minions, and they felt like Execute was just going to be too easy to pull off. We don't really know what future cards or future designs have impacted the thinking behind this change. Also, I guess Warrior is a pretty strong class with multiple archetypes that all run Execute, which is sometimes a sign that a card's too good if every archetype in a class runs it and every archetype is successful. So they're probably looking at some statistics, some numbers that suggest Execute is a little overpowered for what it is. In my mind, it doesn't feel that way necessarily. It's been a pretty core staple of Warrior for a long time, and I don't think people complain about it too much. So surprising to me in many ways. I don't think it kills the card. I don't think this breaks Execute. I think it's still a card you can play. It's going to be a problem, though. Some turns you only have 1 mana to pull it off, right? Like on, if you want to kill that 7/7 on turn 4 that's so famous, used to you could Ravaging Ghoul and Execute for 4 mana. Now you can Ravaging Ghoul and not Execute for 4 mana, so it's going to delay the ability to kill some of those early, really powerful minions. And even in later turns, right, it's harder to find 2 mana than 1 mana, so it might limit your options or flexibility a little bit, so it could have a very negative impact on how efficient Warrior is with their turns. So a nice negative tempo adjustment to Warrior, I guess. Reduces a very popular card's efficiency. It's a change. I don't think it's necessary, but I don't hate it either. I'm pretty neutral about this one. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on Execute. Was this one necessary? Was this a little overkill? And what is Blizzard's thinking behind this one? But all that said, I think Execute is still played. It's really good single target hard removal, which is important to the game. So let's move on to the next one. It's a sort of surprising change, but not an unreasonable one. It is Abusive Sergeant. The effect is staying the same. The only thing that's changing, as you can see from this graphic, is the the attack value is going to be dropped from 2 to 1. So there are a lot of 1 mana 2/1s with positive effects, but this is no longer going to be a 2/1, and it's a 1/1. But the effect is the most important thing about Abusive Sergeant, so I don't think this really impacts the card all that much. The decks that tend to run Abusive Sergeant don't really care too much that it's a 2-attack minion. It's certainly a nice benefit. What they care about are the instant effect of the Battlecry, the fact that you get the 2-attack immediately with minions on board, and the fact that this just plays a body on the board. So I'm talking about decks like Zoo, for instance, love Abusive Sergeant because they're all about bodies and minions, and being able to leverage those cheap minions to trade up to do cooler stuff. And Abusive Sergeant's perfect for that because you can use it on a 1/1, make that a 3/1, attack a 3-health minion, and you've made a very efficient trade, a very efficient play. The Abusive Sergeant that's then left behind, the fact that it's a 2/1 is good because it trades up into more stuff, but the fact that it's just a body is typically more relevant, I think, than the fact that it's a 2/1. The only downside to this is some decks do like to run Abusive Sergeant and just sometimes drop it on turn 1, even if they don't have anything to buff with the Battlecry. They just want to play a minion on turn 1 just to have tempo and get control of the board and have the initiative over their opponent. And this does make Abusive Sergeant way worse in those scenarios, because a 2/1 can trade up into a lot of stuff. A 1/1, of course, can't trade up into quite as much. So in decks that don't have enough 1-drops or a consistent enough early game curve, that could hurt Abusive Sergeant's impact a little. But for combos and all the other things that Abusive Sergeant works well with, this change probably doesn't hurt it too much. So it's going to get worse. It's not as good. Clearly, it's a less good card. But frankly, Abusive Sergeant, I think, is one of the best 1-drops in the game, if not the best 1-drop in the game. So the fact that it was so pervasive across so many kinds of decks, whether control or aggro or everything in between, it probably needed a little bit of a nerf. It's just too good and too strong. So we'll see if this breaks the card. I suspect it won't, but only time will tell. I think Abusive Sergeant sticks around. Let's move on to the next one. Oh, we've only got one more left. Is that right? Let me double check my count. I want to make sure I didn't miss anything. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think I'm missing a card. Let me have to go back and check. So stay tuned to the end of this. But the next card to be nerfed is certainly not a surprise. It is Yogg-Saron, the most complained about card in Hearthstone's history. Fun card, a crazy cool card to watch, but somewhat destructive as far as the health of competitive play is concerned. Yogg-Saron can just do too much and too fast and totally swing games that were otherwise unwinnable into winnable states, and that's not good for a competitive game. So Yogg-Saron is getting changed. You can't tell from this graphic, but I'll sum it up for you. Basically, anytime you play Yogg-Saron, the actual minion on the board, if that minion is killed or transformed or returned to your hand, or your opponent takes control of that minion, basically anything that impacts that Yogg-Saron on the board in a negative way that means he's not alive, so whether he's transformed or taken or removed from the board or killed, anything that makes him not presently active on the board cancels the spell casting process. So, for instance, if you play Yogg-Saron and you have 20 spells loaded up, but he instantly fireballs himself, all 19 spells are lost. Yogg-Saron stops casting spells. The same thing currently happens in the live version of the game. If your Yogg-Saron gets stolen by a Sylvanas, your opponent will start casting your spells instead of you. So this sort of existed to some extent, but basically that's being expanded, and anything that affects Yogg-Saron like that will now stop his spell casting. So, all told, it will really limit Yogg-Saron's total impact, because we've all had those scenarios where Yogg instantly kills himself. So there's going to be those turns where you expect 20 spells and you only get 2. Now, there will still be crazy times when Yogg gets off 20 spells and somehow survives, buffs himself, whatever, and all the spells go through. So he's still playable. Doesn't totally break the card or change the face of the card at all. It just limits him a little. It pulls him back a tad. And this was actually, if you watched my video on recommended changes to Yogg-Saron, 5 ways to fix Yogg-Saron, that was one of my suggestions, so I'm glad Blizzard listened. I think it was probably the most subtle or safe or conservative change too. So I like that they're not going overboard and totally changing the function or face of this card, that they're just doing what they can to limit it a little bit, and I think that will help. I don't know that Yogg will stop being played in competitive environments. I think he's still good enough and strong enough, and those instances where he is just a Hail Mary, get out of jail free card, it's not going to change. He's still like your only hope. So you'll still run Yogg and still put some faith in him, but the lack of consistency will make him a weaker on the ladder, which is nice, so he won't just totally ruin your day when you're trying to climb to legend rank. So all in all, I think that's a pretty positive change on Yogg-Saron. It turns out I was missing a card, and that card is another warrior card, but this time it's Charge. And much like we probably saw hinted at with Rockbiter weapon, again, Blizzard really doesn't seem to like charge effects that are able to instantly kill the opposing hero. Charge, of course, famously used with cards like Raging Worgen to pull that off for huge, ridiculous burst combos. So Charge, not only is it getting its cost reduced, but the change to the effect is also coming through. This is still going to give a friendly minion charge, but that minion cannot attack heroes this turn. So all potential to use this as a burst finisher is completely removed from the game. Also, it no longer gives a +2 attack bonus, so that's a little unfortunate. So Charge essentially is a sort of removal spell now that allows you to kill a minion. It's bad. It's not good. I just don't see how this card is feasible. So now you can basically play down a minion, and let's say it's a Chillwind Yeti for the sake of discussion, and you've played a 4/5, and if you want to charge that in to kill something, you can. It costs you a card in your deck, though. It costs you a mana, and you probably end up killing that minion a lot of the time. So it also sometimes costs you a minion. So it's basically a 2-card combo removal spell that feels very bad. I'd rather just have a spell that dealt damage to the board. So rather just have a fireball, right, than a charging Chillwind Yeti. So I don't really see a place for this. It doesn't make sense to me. I don't know. It just feels wrong. I mean, thank God they reduced the cost, because at 3 mana, clearly this would be totally unplayable. Maybe at 1 mana, there's some weird world where there's like a zoo deck or something that can, a zoo-style warrior deck, I should say, that can play this card, but I actually don't think so. I think they made this card worse. They broke it, and I'm having trouble envisioning a world where this card makes any sense at all. Charging minions are good, but often because they can clear face. I guess there are some scenarios with things like Divine Shield where this card could be pretty strong, but I don't know that Warrior is the right environment for that. There just aren't that many Divine Shield cards that Warrior would want to use, and some of them already have charge anyway. So yeah, you could use this on a Divine Shield. I mean, you could use it on, I guess, a Death Rattle minion, which is cool. Perhaps on cards that like to take damage themselves that otherwise wouldn't be able to use charge. But we never saw that with the regular charge card, and it wasn't that expensive. So if that opportunity exists, I'd like to see it. I'd like to be proven wrong, but I really don't think it does. I don't think this card is going to be played, which is unfortunate because it is, of course, a standard format card that's going to be around forever. So we might have just lost charge for all of time, which is pretty unfortunate. So that said, that wraps up all the changes that are coming to the game. It's pretty clear what Blizzard is trying to accomplish here. Limit burst damage, limit swing turns, encourage minion combat, and tone back a couple ridiculously overpowered things, which are all reasonable goals to accomplish. I don't necessarily agree with all these changes, but nothing feels that wrong to me outside of maybe charge and maybe a little bit of execute. But let's run through those one more time. That's Rockbiter Weapon, Tuskarr, Totemic, Call of the Wild, Execute, Abusive Sergeant, Yogg-Saron, and also Charge. All of them receiving nerfs. So, now that you've heard my thoughts on these changes, I'd like to hear your thoughts. What do you think? What's good? What's bad? What did Blizzard get wrong? And what did they get right? Share your take on these nerfs in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. And until next time, game on.